What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming. The highway at night is a world unto itself. It is not the same asphalt you know in the daylight, with its coffee stops and crowded lanes, its billboards promising cheap motels, and its rhythm of trucks roaring past like iron beasts. No, when the sun sinks and the world empties out, the highway changes its face. The lines on the road glow faintly under the beams of headlights, stretching ahead like veins leading into an unknown heart. Shadows gather at the edges, and every reflector gleams like an eye staring out from the dark. The driver becomes small, a lone traveler carried on a ribbon of black, moving forward into silence. And in that silence, the past begins to stir. Every highway is built over something, over old farmland, over villages forgotten, over graves that were never moved, over battlefields that bled into the earth. The soil remembers even when the maps change. Asphalt does not erase memory. It only covers it like a thin shroud. That is why, when the night deepens and the driver grows weary, strange shapes can sometimes emerge from the margins. A figure by the roadside, a shimmer in the rearview mirror, a sound that should not exist. Among these shapes, none is more feared or more universal than the woman in white. She walks along highways all over the world. She appears in Mexico, in the Philippines, in Ireland, in America. Sometimes she weeps, sometimes she screams, sometimes she simply stands with her face obscured. But always, she's dressed in white. People say she is a bride who never reached the altar, or a young mother who lost her children, or a victim of betrayal and violence. Her story shifts, but her presence is always the same. Sorrow made flesh, grief given a body, walking endlessly because she cannot rest. It is easy to dismiss the tales as folklore, tricks of the tired mind, and yet, ask any long-haul truck driver, any night traveler who has crossed enough miles, and you will hear the same hesitation in their voice, the same pause before they answer. They will not mock the white lady, because deep down they know the road is not empty. They have seen too many things that defy reason. They have passed stretches where the air feels wrong, where the temperature drops without warning, where the radio fills with static, though the night is clear. They have seen figures that vanish when the lights hit them, or heard voices when the windows are rolled tight shut. And sometimes, just sometimes, they have given a ride to a woman who disappears before reaching her destination. But this story, the one I am about to tell you, is not a simple roadside tale. It is not just another echo of the same archetype. This story is the weaving together of what lingers on highways across the world, the voices of grief, the whispers of lost brides, the shadows of mothers and daughters who never made it home. It is the tale of the White Lady of the Highway, told as though she were one spirit wearing countless faces, haunting countless roads. To tell it, we must first enter her world, and to do that, we must take the road at night. The night in question began like any other. The highway was long, stretching between cities that seemed like distant islands of light. The moon hung low, a thin silver coin obscured by drifting clouds. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that makes every breath feel close to a sigh. Few cars passed. Occasionally, a truck thundered by, rattling the empty silence back into life before vanishing again into the black. But mostly, it was just the hum of tires, the faint scent of gasoline, and the endless stretch of road disappearing into the dark. The driver of the car, a man named Daniel, was on his way home from a business trip. He had left the city late, too late, and now he regretted it. His eyes ached from the glare of headlights. His shoulders stiffened with the tension of hours at the wheel. He sipped at lukewarm coffee from a gas station cup, but it did little to sharpen his focus. He told himself he would stop at the next rest area, stretch his legs, maybe doze for a while before continuing. But mile after mile slipped by, and the rest areas seemed to retreat further and further into the dark. It was then that he saw her. At first it was nothing more than a shape by the side of the road. A trick of the eyes, he thought, or perhaps a reflector post that had caught the light. But as he drew closer, the shape became a figure, slender, unmistakably human, a woman. She stood just beyond the guardrail, on the thin strip of grass that bordered the asphalt. Her dress, or was it a gown, was pale, almost luminous, rippling faintly though the night was still. She faced the road, though her features were obscured by the shadows and the glare of the headlights. Daniel's foot eased off the accelerator. Instinct warred with reason. He was on a lonely stretch, miles from the next town. A woman standing here, alone, at this hour, was wrong. Something in him whispered that he should not stop, but another part, the part that still believed in human kindness, slowed the car. Perhaps she had broken down. Perhaps she was in danger. It was unthinkable to leave her alone. The car rolled to a halt, and for a moment, the world went silent. The hum of the engine was the only sound. The headlights bathed her in light, and he saw then that her dress was white. Not just pale, not beige, not grey, but pure white. The kind of white that seemed to glow from within. She lifted her head, and though her face was still obscured, he thought he saw her eyes dark, deep, bottomless. He rolled down the window, his voice rough in the stillness. "Do you need a ride?" She nodded once. Slowly, he unlocked the passenger door, and she opened it without a sound. The hinges did not squeak. The latch did not click. She slid into the seat, and the car seemed to grow colder. Daniel shivered and turned the heat higher, though it was already warm. He glanced at her, intending to ask where she was headed, but the words died in his throat. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, her head bowed, her dress pooling around her like mist. For miles they drove in silence. The road unfurled before them, endless and dark. He tried again. "Where are you going?" Her voice was soft, barely more than a breath. Home, the word sent a chill through him, though he could not say why. He nodded, though she had not given him a destination. He drove on, hoping she would say more, but she did not. The longer she sat beside him, the more the air grew heavy, as though the car itself was sinking into some deeper silence. The radio crackled with static when he tried to turn it on. The dashboard lights dimmed faintly, though the battery was strong. He gripped the wheel tighter, his heart beating faster, though nothing outwardly was wrong. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. One moment she sat beside him, her presence filling the car with cold. The next, the seat was empty. Her white dress, her folded hands, her bowed head. Daniel gasped and swerved, the tires shrieking against the asphalt. He pulled to the shoulder, his chest heaving, sweat beading his forehead despite the chill. The passenger seat was empty. The door was locked. The air was still cold. Daniel sat there for a long time, his hands trembling against the wheel, the night pressing in around him. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called. A truck roared past, its lights blazing, its horn blaring, and then there was silence again, thick and heavy. When at last he forced himself to drive on, he told himself it had been a dream, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had encountered her, the white lady of the highway, the ghost who walks in sorrow, searching for home she can never reach. And this was only the beginning. The car's wheels rolled forward again, but Daniel felt as though he were no longer traveling through the same world. Something had shifted, like a curtain half drawn across the night. The road ahead looked familiar: black asphalt, white lines, the occasional flicker of a reflector, but there was an edge to it now, a tension in the silence that made the hair on his arms stand up. He told himself, again and again, that he was tired, that he had imagined her, that people see things when they have been driving too long. He had read stories about it drivers who spotted phantom deer in the road, or shadowy figures that turned out to be nothing but tree trunks. Hallucinations were not uncommon when fatigue pressed down on the mind. That was what he tried to believe, but his body knew otherwise. The cold still clung to him, even though the heater blew warm air against his face. His chest felt tight, as though someone had pressed a weight against him. And worst of all, the seat beside him seemed not empty, but expectant, as though at any moment she might return, as though she had not truly left. The clock on the dashboard glowed to 37 a.m. He had been driving for hours, yet he could not recall how far he had come since she vanished. Had it been minutes? Had it been miles? Time felt thin, stretched, unreliable. The headlights carved tunnels into the night, revealing nothing but endless road. Occasionally, he thought he saw something just at the edge of their glow, a flicker of white, a suggestion of movement, but when he blinked, it was gone. The shadows clung to the trees like black cloth, and the moon slipped behind clouds, hiding its thin silver face. At last, a sign appeared. Rest area, 1 mile. Relief surged through him. He would stop there, gather himself, maybe splash cold water on his face. He would call his wife, even if it was the middle of the night. Just hearing her voice would tether him back to reality. The exit ramp curved off the highway, and the car bumped along a narrow road lined with flickering lamps. The rest area was almost deserted, just a couple of trucks parked side by side, their cabins dark, engines silent. The lot stretched out wide and empty, bordered by a patch of grass and a line of trees that swayed faintly, though the air was still. Daniel pulled into a space near the restroom building, its windows dimly lit, its vending machines humming faintly in the silence. He killed the engine and sat for a moment, his hands gripping the wheel, his breath shallow. The silence pressed against him, broken only by the tick of the cooling engine. Finally, he forced himself out of the car. The air was damp, carrying the faint smell of wet earth. He walked toward the restroom, the gravel crunching beneath his shoes, his ears straining for any sound that did not belong. His footsteps echoed louder than they should have. Inside, the restroom was empty. Harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, throwing pale reflections on the tiled floor. He washed his face in the sink, the cold water shocking against his skin, and stared into the mirror. His own eyes stared back, tired, bloodshot, but still He tried to laugh, but the sound came out hollow, bouncing back at him from the tiles. "Just tired," he whispered to his reflection. "Just tired." But even as he spoke, something flickered at the edge of the mirror. A shape, a pale dress. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. The restroom was empty. The stalls stood silent, doors ajar. The hum of the lights buzzed overhead, unbroken. When he turned back to the mirror, his reflection was alone again. He left quickly, the door creaking shut behind him. Back at the car, he hesitated. The thought of opening the passenger door again made his stomach tighten. But the lot was empty, and the road still stretched ahead. He had no choice. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled back onto the highway. The miles passed slowly. The road seemed to stretch longer than before, as though every bend hid another endless straightaway. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, and when he took a sip, it tasted bitter, metallic. And then, the air shifted again. The temperature dropped, sudden and sharp, frosting the inside of the windshield with faint crystals. His breath came out in a pale mist. Daniel's grip tightened on the wheel. He knew before he even dared to glance at the passenger seat. She was there. The white lady sat beside him once more, her head bowed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her dress shimmered faintly, like water caught in moonlight. The cold radiated from her, filling the car, seeping into his bones. Daniel's throat went dry. He wanted to speak, to demand who she was, what she wanted, why she had chosen him. But his voice would not rise. His lips parted, but no sound came. Her head lifted slowly. He saw her face this time, pale as paper, her eyes dark and endless, pools of sorrow deeper than any night sky. She looked at him, not through him, not past him, but into him, as though she could see every thought, every memory, every regret carved into his soul. And then she whispered. He shouldn't have stopped. The words slid into him like ice, colder than the air, sharper than a blade. His hands trembled on the wheel. His eyes flicked back to the road, desperate not to lose control. But the words echoed in his head, repeating, circling, sinking deeper. You shouldn't have stopped. His chest constricted. He tried to speak, to explain, to apologize. But she had already lowered her head again, silent, unmoving, as though she had never spoken at all. The road ahead blurred. The lines shimmered, stretching into infinity. His vision wavered, his eyelids heavy, his thoughts clouded. For a moment, he thought he saw other figures by the roadside, more women, more pale dresses, more hollow faces. They lined the highway like mourners at a funeral, their heads turning as his car passed, their eyes watching with bottomless grief. He blinked, and they were gone. The white lady beside him did not move. Miles turned into hours, though the clock on the dashboard hardly changed. Time folded in on itself, and Daniel began to wonder if he had ever left the rest area at all. If he had ever left the city, if he had ever left his home. The world had narrowed to the hum of the engine, the endless road, and the silent figure beside him. Finally, she spoke again, almost home. Her voice was so soft, so delicate, that it might have been the wind whispering through cracks in the window. Yet it carried weight, a finality that made his stomach twist. He dared a glance at her. Her eyes met his, and this time he saw not only sorrow but something else, in emptiness that yearned to be filled. A hunger that was not for food or water, but for something far more profound. He looked back at the road just in time to see the curve ahead. His reflexes screamed, and he swerved, the tires shrieking against the asphalt. The car skidded, the headlights whipping across the trees, the guardrail looming. He fought the wheel, his muscles straining, his breath ragged. The car lurched, swayed, then steadied. He gasped, heart hammering, sweat slick on his skin. The seat beside him was empty again, but the cold remained, and in the distance, faint but growing louder, came the sound of weeping. The following nights were never quiet again. Travelers began to whisper about her in tones of dread, murmuring that the White Lady no longer simply waited by the road, but now pursued those who dared cross her path. Engines failed inexplicably in the dead of night. Headlights flickered out as though swallowed by unseen hands, and radios hissed with strange whispers that were neither static nor signal, but a language meant only for the damned. Each tale grew darker than the last, until her legend was no longer a warning, but an infection spreading from voice to voice. It was said that if you glanced into the rearview mirror, sometimes her pale face would appear behind you, her hollow eyes fixed upon yours, as if she had already chosen you for her next companion into the abyss. One truck driver swore that when he looked into his mirror, he saw her seated in his cab, close enough to breathe against his neck. Though the air was cold as a crypt, he abandoned his truck on the roadside, never to drive again. His rig remained there for weeks, rotting under rain and moonlight, until even the weeds seemed afraid to grow near its rusting wheels. Locals began to abandon the stretch of highway altogether, taking longer routes, even if it meant hours added to their journeys. Businesses along that lonely road withered. Gas stations and diners once alive with chatter turned hollow, the neon lights buzzing in the dark like dying insects, shining only for the ghosts that remained. The land itself felt cursed, the soil soured, as if every tire that rolled across it was another nail driven into an unmarked coffin. Strange footprints were discovered along the shoulders of the highway's mall, delicate, always barefoot, yet they appeared after storms that should have washed them away. They never led far, simply starting from nowhere and vanishing into the void of the road's horizon. No animal dared tread there. Dogs whined and clawed their way back into houses, refusing to follow their masters out past dusk. Birds flew overhead, but never landed near the highway. Even the wind carried an unnatural stillness, a silence so heavy it seemed to press against the chest.
Those who claimed to encounter her often returned broken. One young man, pale and trembling, whispered to the sheriff that he had stopped to help a woman in white waving by the side of the road. She had asked him for a ride to her home, her voice no louder than a sigh, and though he let her into his car, she spoke no more after that. When he arrived at the address she gave, he turned to tell her they had arrived only to find the seat empty. When he staggered to the door of the house, an elderly woman answered, her face weathered by time. He stammered about the girl he had brought. The old woman only wept, saying it was her daughter, dead 20 years, who had been waiting for someone to bring her home. The young man never touched a steering wheel again. He drank himself into an early grave, muttering about white silk and hollow eyes. Some said the White Lady was not one spirit, but many. She was sorrow given form, a collection of broken souls layered into one visage, each scream hidden beneath the veil of another. Perhaps every woman who had died violently along lonely roads had merged into her raw legion of pale figures walking side by side, only appearing as one. For when some travelers described her, they saw hair like snow and lips blue as ice, but others swore her hair was dark, her gown blood-stained, her skin cracked like porcelain. What if the White Lady was every story at once, a tapestry of despair, sewn from all the grief that ever walked these forgotten stretches of asphalt? Yet her appearances grew bolder, as though the boundaries between the living and the dead were wearing thin. Entire vehicles were found abandoned with doors open, headlights still on, their drivers missing without trace. A single white shoe, soaked in rain, was often the only sign left behind. Once, a patrol officer followed reports of screams along the highway. When he arrived, he found the screams came from nowhere and everywhere, circling him like a storm. The sound shattered his mind, and by dawn he was found sitting in his cruiser, eyes wide, unable to speak again. His lips moved, but no words came. No errors came, only the motion of silent cries repeating over and over, as if mimicking someone else's final moments. The White Lady was no longer content to wait. She hunted. There were stories of drivers who thought they escaped her, only to find her in places she should never be. A woman who had driven clear of the highway swore she awoke in her own home to the sound of weeping in the hallway. When she opened a door, the pale figure in the stained gown was standing at the foot of her bed. The next morning, her house was empty. her bed unslept in, as though she had walked into the night with the ghost and never returned. Priests were called, rituals were attempted, crosses were planted in the earth, prayers spoken into the darkness, holy water scattered like rain, yet the White Lady remained, her presence mocking every attempt to banish her. If anything, the rituals seemed to enrage her further. One priest was found dead in his rectory, his face frozen in a scream, his mirror shattered into 1,000 shards, all reflecting the pale figure of a woman no one else could see. By then, the highway was no longer just haunted, it had become an altar of despair. Each mile held a secret, each curve a grave, each shadow the memory of someone torn from life too soon. The line between natural and supernatural blurred, until even the most rational minds began to wonder whether they were driving upon the earth at all, or along a road built into the boundary of hell itself. And so the legend of the White Lady swelled into something larger than a ghost story. She became a force, a curse, an omen of what awaits when sorrow festers and is never released. The living could not escape her, the dead could not silence her, and time itself seemed to bend around her presence. She was despair with a face, grief with a body, eternity wrapped in white cloth that fluttered against the blackness of the road. The fear grew heavier, as if the very asphalt absorbed the anguish of each traveler, binding them into her endless lament. Some began to say that the highway itself was alive, and the White Lady was not its ghost, but its heart. Bleeding into the night, it was in these whispers that the haunting deepened, preparing to tear open a wound far greater than any soul had yet seen, a rift where the veil between this world and the next would burn away like mist under the pale moonlight.
The highway had grown into something monstrous, a living wound stretched across the earth, no longer just a road of asphalt and painted lines. It had become a corridor between worlds, a thin grey scar that pulsed beneath moonlight. Travelers who dared its path spoke of feeling as though the air itself thickened, like walking into water. Headlights dimmed, not from the failure of electricity, but from the oppressive weight of shadow that clung to every particle of air. At the center of it all stood the White Lady. She was no longer whispered of as a ghostly hitchhiker, no longer reduced to a tale of a woman waiting for a ride home. She had grown beyond folklore, become an elemental presence, a spirit, vast and terrible, clothed in mourning, draped in sorrow, her gown fluttering, though no wind stirred. The stories said that she could appear anywhere, sometimes on the shoulder of the road, sometimes directly in the middle of the lane. But now, those who ventured down that forsaken stretch began to see her not as a figure of flesh and bone, but as something greater. She stretched across the horizon, her gown trailing into infinity. At times, her form fractured into countless pale women, each one stepping out of the mist like echoes, like broken memories stitched into existence. It was not just the living who began to see her. The dead, too, spoke of her in whispers through mediums and dreamers. Seances conducted far from the highway found themselves interrupted by the same presence, a pale figure who pressed her face against the thin fabric of the veil and peered in with hollow eyes. Those who touched her essence through spiritual practice described an infinite sorrow, an emptiness so vast it devoured their own griefs and replaced them with hers. They trembled, they wept uncontrollably, and some refused ever to sit in circle again. Legends began to overlap. Some said she was the remnant of a woman murdered along the highway, doomed to replay her agony. Others swore she was older than the road itself, perhaps a fragment of an ancient mourning spirit bound to the earth long before cars existed, long before asphalt split the land. She had worn many names across cultures, appearing always as a woman in white, always where tragedy pooled, always where human sorrow lingered too long. The highway had not created her, it had only awakened her. One man, a researcher of the occult named Elias Harrow, dared to seek the truth. He drove into the heart of that cursed stretch, not with fear but with grim determination. He brought with him cameras, recorders, crucifixes, talismans, and journals filled with half-deciphered incantations. He told no one of his exact journey, save for a single letter left on his desk. "If I do not return, know that she has claimed me, and pray that she does not follow you home." Elias's last known recordings, later recovered from a shattered dashboard camera, began in the mundane tones of a scientist, but quickly unraveled into the panic of a hunted man. At first, he described the thickening air, the silence of the insects, the eerie stillness of the trees. Then came the first distortion, the road stretching farther than it should, his odometer spinning though he never seemed to advance. At one point, He whispered that he saw her reflected in his rearview mirror, not behind the car, but inside it, seated in the passenger's seat. He dared not turn his head. He only muttered prayers under his breath. Hours passed on his tape, though the clock insisted it had been minutes. His voice trembled as he began to weep. She is everywhere. She is the road. Every mile is her body. Every shadow is her hair. I cannot escape. Then the tape ended in static, broken only by a faint, feminine whisper. Stay. Elias was never found. His car was discovered abandoned near mile marker 13. Its doors flung open, his belongings scattered like offerings. The only trace of him was a smear of handprints on the inside of the windshield, pressed outward, as if he had been dragged through the glass by unseen hands. After Ilias's disappearance, the haunting escalated to a fever pitch. Those who drove the road at night spoke of entire processions of white ladies walking its edges, silent and endless, their gowns brushing the earth like waves of moonlight. Some claimed the figures sang low, mournful dirges that vibrated in the bones more than in the ears. Others heard nothing but the sound of their own heartbeat, racing against the suffocating silence. A spiritual climax was unfolding. The highway no longer merely hosted the ghost, it had become the ghost. Asphalt crumbled at odd angles, cracks forming shapes that resembled faces mid-scream. Guardrails twisted in impossible ways, as if bent by invisible hands. One night, a storm rolled through, and lightning illuminated the clouds, not in flashes but in shapes, faces upon faces, hollow eyes and open mouths, staring downward as though the sky itself had become a graveyard of grief. Those who encountered the White Lady up close described her transformation. She was no longer merely sorrowful, she was wrathful. Her eyes burned like hollow lanterns, her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, her scream not carried on the air, but inside the skull. Some witnesses bled from their ears, some clawed at their own eyes, desperate to escape the vision. Those who survived never spoke with coherence again, yet there were whispers that beneath the terror lay a plea. Some believed the White Lady did not seek to harm, but to be freed. She was bound to the road, shackled by the memory of violence, of betrayal, of despair too heavy to bear. She was both tormentor and tormented, prison guard and prisoner, her eternity twisted into endless repetition. Perhaps the only reason she reached out to travelers was not to destroy them, but to beg for release. But how does one release sorrow as old as time? How does one exorcise despair that has grown into a goddess of mourning? It was then that a small group of mystics, drawn by tales of the White Lady, came to the road. They were not priests, not hunters, not exorcists, but seekers, those who believed that if sorrow had a body, compassion might be its undoing. They gathered at midnight upon the asphalt, chanting prayers of light, whispering words of forgiveness, their hands raised, not in fear but in offering. For a moment, the air shifted. The night seemed to breathe. Out of the mist, she appeared, her form fractured and reforming, her gown torn between beauty and decay. Her face was 1,000 faces, her cry 1,000 cries. She moved toward them, her hands outstretched, her hollow eyes reflecting not hatred, but an endless plea. The mystics wept. They felt her pain, not as an echo, but as if it were their own, filling every corner of their hearts until they drowned in grief. Some collapsed to their knees, clutching their chests, unable to bear the weight of centuries. But one remained standing, a young woman, with a voice steady and low. She whispered words that no recording captured, words that belonged to a language older than memory. The White Lady paused. The gown fluttered. The silence grew heavier, then lighter, as though the very night leaned closer to listen. For the first time, her eyes blinked, slow and deliberate, and a single tear traced her pallid cheek. Then the ground trembled, the highway groaned, the air split with a scream that shook the stars, and then she was gone. The mystics collapsed, unconscious. When they awoke, the road was quiet, eerily so. No mist, no cries, no footprints. For a time, they believed they had succeeded, that compassion had broken the curse. But legends do not end so easily. Asterisk for a fleeting span. The silence that followed her vanishing was intoxicating. The mystics who had dared to meet her upon the highway, still trembling in their bones, convinced themselves that their ritual of compassion had pierced the veil and unbound her sorrow. The young woman whose voice had whispered in a tongue older than memory felt as though she had touched the very heart of grief and soothed it. They staggered back into the waking world, believing that they had witnessed the final breath of the White Lady. But hope was a fragile vessel, and it cracked quickly. 2 nights later, Travelers reported her again, not only, as before, lingering by the roadside, but now everywhere. She no longer waited passively for a chance encounter. She came unbidden, pouring herself into dreams, haunting televisions with flickering static, weaving her reflection into mirrors where no highway was in sight. The attempt at compassion had not freed her, had fed her. The recognition of her grief, the acknowledgement of her suffering, had given her form new strength. She had been seen not as a phantom but as a deity of sorrow. And gods are not easily forgotten once worship begins. The mystics dispersed, but none escaped unscathed. One drowned in her own tears, discovered lifeless in her apartment, with no water to be found in the room. Another vanished, leaving behind a spiral of footprints burnt into the floorboards of his home. The young woman who had spoken the forbidden words awoke one morning, unable to speak at all. Her tongue had turned the color of ash, and though she tried to cry, no sound escaped her. Yet each night, those who listened carefully swore they heard her voice chanting from the highway still, as though her essence had been swallowed by the ghost she had tried to soothe.
The White Lady was now more than a haunting, she was ascension. Her sorrow had evolved into dominion, and the highway had become a temple of despair. Cars that entered after midnight did not always emerge. A stretch that should have taken 20 minutes devoured hours, sometimes entire nights. When drivers reappeared, their hair had turned white, their eyes hollow, their minds fractured by visions of endless corridors of pale women walking beside their cars, faces pressed against the glass, hands stroking the windows, as though they were the walls of a coffin. Those who vanished completely were whispered of in hushed tones. They were the chosen, some said, claimed by her as companions for eternity. Others believed they had been pulled into another dimension, a shadow road that mirrored the one we know, but stretched only into infinite night. Truckers began to call it the Midnight Parallel, a second highway layered over the first, accessible only when the White Lady desired, where the asphalt was liquid and the sky was black glass filled with screaming faces. The government, uneasy about the growing hysteria, quietly sent teams to investigate. Highway patrols were doubled, cameras installed, and forensic researchers dispatched to study the phenomenon of vanishing cars. Yet equipment failed within the cursed zone. Batteries drained in minutes, signals collapsed, footage dissolved into static. One patrol car, equipped with military-grade surveillance gear, managed to record for exactly 3 minutes before all systems died. In those 3 minutes, the dashcam showed the road bending in impossible shapes, the painted lines curling like serpents, the trees twisting toward the car with branch-like fingers. At the edge of the frame, always just out of focus, stood a woman in white, her face blurred, her form pulsing as if she were made not of flesh but of memory. The officers who drove that car were found wandering a cornfield 6 miles away at dawn, their uniforms soaked in blood that was not their own. They had no recollection of how they had left the vehicle. One muttered a single phrase over and over until his voice gave out. She opened the door. Religious institutions took notice. Some declared her an unclean spirit, a demon wearing the mask of sorrow. Others claimed she was an angel of mourning, punishing mankind for neglecting its dead. Pilgrims began to appear at the road's edge, lighting candles, laying down white lilies, kneeling upon the gravel to whisper prayers. And sometimes, just sometimes, their offerings vanished before dawn, as though someone or something had accepted them. But the more offerings were made, the stronger her manifestations grew. Soon, entire convoys of cars vanished without a trace. The White Lady began to appear not only to individuals but to groups, standing in the middle of the road, her gown spreading outward until it seemed to cover every inch of asphalt. Some witnesses described her body growing until she was taller than the trees, her arms extending across the horizon. Others swore she shrank, climbing into the back seats of their cars, whispering into their ears until they swerved off the road. Then came the storm. It was unlike any storm the region had seen. The sky split open with lightning not of gold but of bone white, illuminating clouds shaped like screaming faces. Rain fell like tears, bitter and salt-heavy, stinging skin and corroding metal. The highway buckled, as if an earthquake trembled beneath it, though seismographs recorded nothing. Those caught upon the road during the storm said they heard a chorus of voices in the thunder, 1,000 women crying in unison. Their wails, stretching across the heavens, dotted the storm's center. They said, the White Lady walked. She did not vanish into mist as before, but strode baldly down the asphalt, her gown dragging like a shroud. Every time lightning struck, Her figure multiplied, dozens, then hundreds, until the road was filled with women in white, walking side by side, hands clasped in unity. They were no longer fragments, they were legion, and at that moment, the truth could no longer be denied. She was not a single ghost at all, but the embodiment of every sorrowed soul abandoned on the highways of the world. Every woman betrayed, every mother lost, every daughter taken too soon, bound together, woven into one endless grief. The White Lady was not a haunting, she was mourning itself, weaponized and incarnate. The climax was not simply terror, it was revelation. Those who survived the storm did not speak of her with fear alone, but with reverence. As if they had glimpsed the face of a divine sorrow too vast for comprehension, they began to write hymns in her name, poems that spoke of her as the bride of silence, the mother of mourning, the eternal widow. And yet, their reverence did not save them from her touch. Many vanished soon after, their devotion mistaken perhaps for consent, their prayers perhaps answered with assimilation. For in the end, to worship sorrow is to be devoured by it. The highway stood quiet once more when the storm passed, but it was the quiet of a battlefield after slaughter. Abandoned cars lined the ditches, doors open, engines dead, shoes lay scattered in the mud, always one of a pair, as if their owners had stepped into eternity midst. No bodies were ever recovered, and yet, those who walked the road at dawn swore they heard weeping in the distance, gentle, endless, like waves upon a shore of grief. The White Lady had not been vanquished, she had only grown. The spiritual climax of her haunting was not her destruction, but her enthronement. The highway was hers, utterly and forever, a kingdom of asphalt, shadow, and tears, where sorrow reigned eternal. The highway stretched into the horizon, endless and unmoving, as though it had ceased to belong to the world of men. Even the sun no longer seemed to touch it the same way. At noon, when light should have bleached the asphalt gray and warmed its surface to shimmering heat, the road remained cold, shadowed, and black, like a scar that refused to heal. Birds wheeled high above, but none crossed directly over the cursed stretch. It was as if they, too, understood what lay beneath. Locals learned to live around it. They rerouted their paths, tore down signs, warned strangers at gas stations not to drive that way after dark. "Take the longer road," they said, with nervous smiles. "Better to be late than to be lost." And yet, curiosity has always been stronger than fear. Newcomers and thrill-seekers ignored the warnings, whispering to each other in eager voices about ghosts, about legends, about a woman in white. Some sought to film her, to capture her on camera, to turn her into entertainment. They never returned. What began as hushed stories became a contagion. The White Lady seeped into newspapers, late-night radio programs, even children's tales told around campfires. But unlike most legends, her power grew with each telling. The more people spoke of her, the stronger she became. Stories were not simply recountings, they were invocations. Every voice that whispered her name offered her breath. Every imagination that pictured her face gave her form. And soon, she was no longer bound to the highway alone. A man driving in another state, hundreds of miles away, claimed he glimpsed her in his rearview mirror. She was not clear, just a pale outline, seated in the back seat, her head bent, her hair falling forward like a veil. He swerved in terror, barely missing a collision. Another family camping in the woods awoke to the sound of weeping outside their tent. When they unzipped the flap, they saw nothing but trees. Yet in the morning, fresh footprints trailed around their camp bare, delicate, always leading nowhere. The White Lady had become migratory, not through her own steps, but through memory itself. She traveled along the roads of thought, carried by stories, invoked by fear, sustained by grief. And grief is everywhere. Authorities tried to silence the legend. Newspapers were pressured to stop reporting. TV hosts were warned against sensationalism, yet suppression only fanned the flames. What was forbidden became irresistible. Paranormal forums brimmed with accounts, some true, some fabricated, all feeding the fire. Artists painted her, writers wrote about her, musicians composed songs laced with sorrow, inspired by her wails. And through every channel, every medium, she seeped further into the cracks of human consciousness. It was no longer possible to tell where the legend ended and reality began. One chilling night, a convoy of cars was found parked in perfect formation along the cursed stretch of highway. Headlights still on, doors wide open, engines humming, but every seat was empty. 11 vehicles, No sign of struggle, no bodies, no footprints leading away, only silence. The investigation made national headlines. Yet even as the news anchors spoke, the footage of the empty cars began to distort. A pale shape flickered across the screens, her hollow eyes staring directly into living rooms across the country. Millions saw her, whether they admitted it or not, and still she grew. There were attempts at resistance. Priests brought relics, shamans burned sage until the smoke choked the sky. Psychics wept and convulsed, calling upon ancestors and angels, but none prevailed. The highway swallowed their efforts whole, as if mocking them. Crosses planted in the earth turned upside down overnight. Ritual circles drawn in chalk melted into spirals of ash. Holy water hissed upon the asphalt, as though poured onto burning stone. And always, in the distance, the sound of a woman's voice, crying and laughing in the same breath, echoing like wind through a hollow crypt. For those brave or foolish enough to confront her directly, the experience was never the same twice. To some, she appeared as a young bride, her gown stained with road dust, her eyes pleading for a ride home. To others, she was a towering specter, her face fractured into dozens of faces, her mouth open in a silent scream. And sometimes, she did not appear at all. Instead, the road itself came alive, the lines twisting into serpents, the asphalt buckling, the trees leaning inward until the driver felt as though he were being funneled into the throat of some vast, invisible beast. No one could deny the truth any longer. She was not a ghost. She was an empire of grief, a cathedral built from despair, a living manifestation of every unwept tear, every unspoken goodbye. Humanity had built her, nurtured her, and now humanity would never escape her. The chilling realization was that she did not need to kill. Death was incidental. Her true dominion was despair. Those who survived her touch carried her forever afterward. A businessman who encountered her while driving alone later abandoned his career, unable to sit in boardrooms without hearing her weeping in the hum of fluorescent lights. A mother who saw her face pressed against her car window found herself incapable of looking at her own child without seeing a white gown fluttering behind him in every reflection. Survivors lived, yes, but they lived broken, hollowed, carrying her in their minds like a parasite that fed upon memory. The highway itself became a forbidden place. Government maps quietly erased it. GPS systems rerouted without explanation. Yet no erasure was perfect. Sometimes, by accident or by fate, a traveler would find themselves upon that road, confused at first, then terrified, then gone. And the ending, if there could ever be an ending, was not a conclusion but a spreading. For one autumn night, as fog rolled heavy and pale across the land, sightings of the White Lady surged, not just near the highway, but across the world. A trucker in Brazil, a student in Tokyo, a widow in Ireland. They all reported the same figure, a pale woman, gown fluttering, eyes hollow, lips trembling with grief. She had become untethered, unbound by geography. The legend had consumed enough stories, enough belief, enough grief to transcend her birthplace. Now, she was everywhere, and so the tale does not end with victory or defeat, with exorcism or banishment. It ends, as sorrow always ends, not with closure, but with continuation. For sorrow never truly leaves. It lingers in the empty chair at the table, the photograph on the mantle, the voicemail never deleted. It lingers in the silence after laughter, in the weight of memory. And the White Lady is that lingering, given form. The next time you drive at night, alone on a deserted road, and the headlights falter, and the mist thickens, and you glimpse a figure in white at the edge of your vision, do not slow down. Do not look directly into the rearview mirror. Do not acknowledge her presence. For the moment you do, the moment you see her as she longs to be seen, she will step closer. And if you should ever hear her voice, whispering from the darkness, remember this: she is not asking for help, she is asking for company. Her kingdom stretches forever now, not only on that forsaken highway, but in every shadowed mile, every lonely drive, every sleepless night. The world has become her road, and she will walk it eternally, draped in sorrow, reaching for you, always closer. Never gone.